Sorry guys, we got interrupted by a phone call and now I'm just barely getting back to this. So we're going to finish the book. We're going to just push through and finish it today. So if we need to do it in a couple of settings, that's totally fine, but we're going to get it done. Okay, so I'm going to try and sit a little closer. More like, be careful who you trust, Vanessa said, and don't cross the society. We're always a step ahead. Oh, so then we shouldn't team up, Kendra said. You don't have a choice, Vanessa laughed darkly. Neither do I. None of us can flee, and if we fight each other, none of us will leave here alive. You can't afford to pass up my help defeating the Guardian, nor can I afford to pass up yours. And albino or not, Warren is looking paler by the minute. Kendra looked down at the panther. She glanced at Warren. What do you think? He sighed. Honestly, we better work with her to kill the cat. Even with a combined effort, it will be a challenge. Okay, Kendra said. Anything good in the pouch? Vanessa asked. Probably, but we don't know one potion from another, Kendra said. I'm not sure I could be much help in discerning potions, Vanessa said. She looked at Warren. Your shirt is soaked. His shirt was bound to his abdomen, and it was indeed drenched in blood. His naked chest was bathed in sweat. I'm all right. Better than Christopher. I'm quite good with a sword, Vanessa said. I can hold my own, Warren replied. Fair enough. Finders keepers, she said. Patience is our best weapon. If we do this right, we can dispatch it without ever touching the ground. You be our eyes, Kendra, Warren said, lowering himself. Vanessa sank towards the floor as well. Kendra hovered, watching the baleful panther prowl around, gazing up at the flying people. Vanessa and Warren floated apart from one another, dipping low enough to bait and tease the panther, rising out of reach when it leapt up at them. Vanessa finally got into good positions and hurled the spear into the panther's ribs. As the panther moved around, the spear eventually dislodged. Warren lured the panther away and Vanessa retrieved the weapon. They continued baiting the panther until Vanessa harpooned it again. Soon the animal collapsed and Warren finished it with a sword. Sharp blade, Vanessa remarked. It cuts deep. Weapons ready, they hovered above the floor, watching as the panther emerged from its own corpse, now the size of a tiger. Before long, the glossy black coat had been punctured multiple times with the spear, and the great beast finally succumbed. You're not doing much with that sword, Vanessa commented. I'll use it when the time comes, Warren said. Here comes the seventh life, Vanessa said. This time, with a mighty roar that echoed through the tall room, the panther was reincarnated, standing as tall as a horse, with dagger claws and saber-toothed fangs. 4 writhing serpents, like snakes, black with red markings, grew out of its powerful shoulders. Now that's a cat, Warren said. Warren and Vanessa started baiting the huge panther, but it did not come at them. Instead, it crouched near the center of the room, keeping the pedestal between itself and Vanessa. They ventured lower and lower, trying to tempt the panther to break cover. Finally, with terrifying suddenness, the panther dashed at Warren and vaulted alarmingly high. Warren fell upwards at full speed, but not before a lashing serpent struck him on the calf. Vanessa was in an ideal position, but used the opportunity, was not in an ideal position, but used the opportunity to let the spear fly. It pierced the panther just above her rear leg. Bawling, the panther sprang at her as well, again achieving a phenomenal height, just missing her. I got nipped on the calf, Warren said. One of the snakes? Vanessa asked. Yeah. Warren rolled up his pant leg to look at the bite marks. Below them, the panther crouched near the pedestal, the spear still in its leg. Using small bursts of gravity and kicking her legs, Vanessa made her way awkwardly over to Warren, moving vaguely like a jellyfish. You'd better lend me the sword, Vanessa said. It will not be a gentle venom. One of these potions counteracts poison, Kendra said. And probably 5 of them are poison, Vanessa replied. Time is essential, Warren. I'll need you with me as we face the final forms. Vanessa gave her the sword. Vanessa dropped tantalizingly close to the ground, lower than Warren would have been when the giant panther reached him. The ferocious feline charged and pounced. Instead of soaring up to escape as the panther anticipated, Vanessa dropped and with a sweep of the sword opened a tremendous wound across the great cat's underbelly. Vanessa hit the ground hard and instantly took flight, but there was no need. The panther was lying on its side, serpents thrashing, body twitching. Warren dropped to the ground and retrieved the spear, then rejoined Vanessa in the air. We've got another one coming, Vanessa announced as the body began to fold in upon itself. How are you holding up? She asked Warren. So far, so good, he said, but he looked exhausted. Twin roars resounded through the towering room. The panther, now much larger than a horse, had sprouted a second head. The doubly fierce creature had no snakes or other oddities. It paced beneath them with feral intensity. Want to bait or throw? Vanessa asked. I'd better bait, he said, giving her the spear and taking the sword. Warren went lower, but not much lower. The panther was no longer cowering behind the pedestal. It paced in the open as if daring them to come closer. Warren still looked to be well out of reach when the panther sprang, and from gaping mouths expelled a spray of black sludge. The two-headed panther had not come up directly below Warren, so the spray came at him diagonally, splattering his chest and legs. Instantly, Warren was screaming. Tendrils of smoke steamed up from where the volatile substance clung to him. He dropped the sword and brushed frantically at the searing sludge. Thrashing and groaning, Warren rose even higher until he reached the spikes in the roof and used them to make his way to the catwalk where he collapsed. Vanessa and Kendra followed Warren and knelt on the catwalk beside him. His body was charred wherever the sludge had splattered. Acid or something, he muttered feverishly, eyes wild. Vanessa cut open his pant leg. The flesh around the snake bite was swollen and discolored. We can't get him out of here, Kendra asked Vanessa. The tower will not let us leave without the artifact, Vanessa said, a safeguard to protect its secrets. Can any traps be worse than that thing? Kendra asked. Yes, Vanessa said. The traps that prevent a premature exit will be rigged to cause certain death. The Guardian can be defeated. The traps probably cannot. Hand over the potion pouch. Warren is dying. Blind luck is better than none. Vanessa began considering various bottles, uncapping a few to sniff them. Below, the panther heads roared. No potions, Warren gasped. Give me the spear. Vanessa gave him a sidelong glance. You're in no condition. The spear, he said, sitting up. This might buy you time, Vanessa said, holding up a bottle. I think I recognize the potion. It has a distinctive odor. It will transform your body into a gaseous state. During that time, the poison will not spread, acid will not burn, and blood will not flow. Vanessa held it out to him. Lips twisted into a grimace, Warren shook his head. Vanessa held out the spear. Snatching it, Warren rolled off the edge of the catwalk. He was controlling his fall with the rod, but descending rapidly. Warren yelled, a primal, barbaric challenge. The two-headed panther snarled at him. Warren cried out again directly above the feline monstrosity. The monster reared up to meet him, jaws agape. Holding the spear poised, Warren let himself fall at full speed the final 30 feet. And so it was with tremendous force that he plunged the spear between the two necks an instant before striking the unyielding floor. With more than half the length of the spear buried into its body, the mighty beast took a few drunken steps, wobbled, leaned, and then slumped to the floor. Kendra grabbed the bottle from Vanessa and dove off the catwalk. She kept full gravity, and an incredible rush of wind washed over her as she plummeted downward. She whipped the rod around, and her fall began to slow, and then she brought the rod level, coming to a perfect stop beside Warren. Warren was a wreck, face down, unconscious, breathing shallowly. Heaving both hands, Kendra rolled him over, wincing as something inside of him crunched. His mouth was open. Tilting his head back, she tried to ignore the snapping sound his neck made and dumped the potion into his mouth. His Adam's apple, it's like a little bumper here, bobbled, and much of the fluid leaked out of the sides of his mouth. Once again, the body of the monster was bulging and undulating as if it were about to erupt. Vanessa was yanking on the spear, tugging it out a little at a time, leaning into it with everything she had. Get clear, Get clear, Kendra, Vanessa said. This is not over. When Kendra looked back at Warren, he was wispy and translucent. She tried to touch him, and her hand passed through him like he was a mist, dissipating him slightly. So he kind of turned into sort of like a misty kind of ghost. Kendra raced across the floor and grabbed the sword. Behind her, Vanessa finally jerked the spear free. As Vanessa launched into the air, Kendra watched the ninth version of the Guardian emerge. Long wings unfurled. 12 serpents sprouted from various spots along its back. 3 heavy tails swayed, and 3 heads bellowed together, a deafening sound even from where Kendra stood behind the beast. The great wings beat down, and the beast took flight, pursuing Vanessa. Kendra gaped in petrified awe. From wingtip to wingtip, the monstrosity stretched across half the cavernous room, and it rose swiftly. Running out of room to go up, Vanessa started falling instead of rising, hurling the spear as she neared her pursuer. The weapon merely grazed the monster and tumbled towards the floor. All three heads snapped at Vanessa, and all missed. She rebounded off its well-muscled body, snake striking eagerly, and tumbled towards the ground. Vanessa managed to slow her descent at the last moment, but she still landed heavily only a moment after the spear struck the floor. Like Arrow before her, she lost her grip of the rod, and it floated away toward the ceiling. Quivering, snake-bitten, dragging a broken leg, she crawled for the spear. Above, the three-headed fiend descended, roaring excellently. Beyond... This does not look good, you guys. Beyond the monster, Kendra saw a pair of figures falling toward her. Propping herself up with a spear, Vanessa stood and faced the three-headed monster cat as it landed before her. The cat watched her from well out of reach. Kendra recognized Tanu and Coulter descending swiftly, both of them albino, and she waved her arms at them. Even as scalding sludge fountained from three mouths, dousing Vanessa in blistering agony, Tanu alighted beside Kendra, snatched his potion pouch, and upended a bottle into his mouth. He accepted the sword from Kendra, and as Vanessa screamed, Tanu expanded, clothes splitting as he doubled in height, a huge man becoming a giant, the sword looked like a little knife in his enormous hand. Too late, the three-headed monster turned as Tanu raged, stabbing and slashing, hacking off wings and serpents even as he was clawed and bitten. Tanu's heavy arm pistoned mercilessly against the monster, and the monster crumpled, and Tanu collapsed atop the beast, bleeding from bitter wounds. Kendra watched in horror as the carcass of the monster began to boil. Tanu scooted away from it, but this time, instead of it folding in upon itself, the corpse melted away and simmered into nothingness, as if it had never even been. Coulter and Kendra ran to Tanu, who lay on his side. The white Simone pointed at the space the monster had occupied. There sat a bright copper teapot, worked into the shape of a cat, with the tail forming the spout. Coulter retrieved it. "Doesn't look like much," he said. "I may need to touch it," Kendra said, taking the pot from him. Light at first, the pot started getting heavier. The outside of the pot didn't change, but Kendra recognized the difference. "It's filling up." "Pour it," Tanu gasped. Tanu had 3 deep, ragged gouges across his beefy forearm. Kendra poured golden dust from the teapot onto the wounds. Most of the dust seemed to dissolve on contact. The gouges vanished, leaving no scar. An enormous chunk of flesh was missing from Tanu's shoulder, but when Kendra filled the gaping wound with the dust from the teapot, it closed, and the skin above it looked like new. As Kendra shook the feline teapot over Tanu, his white flesh returned to a healthy brown, and all his wounds closed and vanished. Tanu shook his head, powdery dust rising from his hair. Kendra hurried over to Vanessa, who lay moaning, withered, unrecognizable, incapable of movement or speech. "I should heal her," Kendra said. "I would love to say no," Tanu said, "but it is the right thing to do." "Technically, we're not on the preserve," Coulter reminded them. "What happens in here stays in here." "Don't let her near any of the weapons," Kendra warned them. Coulter kicked the spear away as Kendra coated Vanessa with the dust from the teapot. The healing dust renewed itself, and continued to flow until Kendra stopped pouring, so it never ran out of the pot. It kept coming and coming. Leaving Vanessa perfectly whole and unscarred, she sat up, staring at the teapot in wonder. "Nothing could have cured those burns," she said in amazement. "I was blind and nearly deaf." What? That's an amazing teapot. "This is over," Tanu said to Vanessa. "There are others stronger than us waiting just outside the entrance." Vanessa said nothing more. Coulter remained near her, sword in hand. "I suppose it goes without saying, if you slip into a trance, you'll never come out of it." Kendra went over to Arrow and dumped dust on him. Nothing changed because he was really dead. "We may be able to save Warren," Kendra said. "I noticed that he was gaseous," Tanu said, having tied his torn clothes together around into a loincloth, "which means he is alive. The potions would not have worked if he were dead. He must be nearly gone, or he would be able to move around freely in his gaseous state. Instead, he lies in a daze. Considering the power of the dust in that artifact, I am sure we will be able to restore him. Dale will thank you forever." Vanessa said she found you in the woods and put you to sleep, Kendra said. Well, then she was lying, Tanu said. Bluffing, Vanessa rephrased. When I came to myself, I returned to the house, Tanu continued. I approached cautiously and must have arrived not long after Vanessa departed to come here. I picked the locks to the dungeon. It was much easier to sneak into that prison than to sneak out. Your grandparents are fine. They retrieved the register, and we found friends waiting outside the gates of Fablehaven. Not long after that, Tanu returned to his regular size and adjusted his clothes. They stood next to the ghostly, smoky form of Warren until the gas coalesced and he became solid once more. As soon as he became tangible, Kendra covered him with dust from the teapot, mending broken bones and poisoned tissue and burns and ruptured organs. He sat up, blinking, unbelieving. When he removed the blood-soaked shirt from his abdomen, he found no mark beneath it. Warren was no longer albino. He had dark hair and intense hazel eyes. Kendra also dusted Coulter, curing his albinism, so none of them are albinos and white anymore. We should hurry, Tanu said. Dale will be needing some healing himself. The hobgoblin left him lame. They bound Vanessa's hands with the same rope that had bandaged Warren and levitated up to the catwalk, Tanu holding Vanessa. They replaced their rods in the alcove. No monkeys stirred as they crossed the mosaic, although they had to tread carefully on the stairs. They found Dale in the sandy room, where only the blue woman, the half-spider, and the dwarf remained on the walls. Dale shouted in ecstasy upon seeing his brother revived and well, and they embraced for a long while before Kendra could get near enough to heal his legs. Once his legs were well, Dale stared at the teapot in wonder, wiping away tears of joy and proclaiming now that he had officially seen everything. One final surprise awaited Kendra. When at length they reached the uppermost chamber in the tower and climbed the knotted rope to reach the stone platform in the formerly cursed grove, she found the Sphinx and Mr. Lich waiting to welcome them. Okay, last chapter is the quiet box. Ah, the quiet box. Tell me about the cat again, Seth said, sitting on the bed with his legs crossed, trying to juggle 3 blocks. Again? Kendra said, looking up from her book. I can't believe I missed the coolest thing anyone has ever seen, Seth complained, losing control of the blocks over 2 tosses. A giant, flying, snake-covered, 3-headed, acid-breathing panther? If you hadn't witnessed it, I'd be sure that you were making it up just to torture me. Yeah, well, being there wasn't much fun, Kendra said. I was pretty sure we were all going to die. And it hosed down Vanessa with a massive acid blast, he continued enthusiastically. Was she screaming? She couldn't scream, Kendra said. She was just sort of moaning. She looked like she'd been dipped in lava. All that to guard the lamest thing ever, a shabby old teapot. A teapot that cured all your zombie wounds, Kendra said. I mean, I know, it's useful, but it looks like a bad decision from a really pathetic garage sale. You just look at it. You just like it because your fairy voodoo made it work. He started trying to juggle again and immediately lost the rhythm, one of the blocks falling to the floor. Grandpa opened the door to the attic bedroom. The Sphinx says he's ready, if you still want to join us, he said. Kendra smiled. It was nice seeing Grandpa walking around again like his old self. To her, healing Grandpa Sorensen had seemed like the most miraculous consequence of retrieving the artifact. The other injuries were so recent that they had somehow not sunk in as being so real. It had been as if the teapot were washing away the memories of a bad dream. But Grandpa had been in a wheelchair ever since she'd arrived at Fablehaven this year, so watching him cut off the cast and walk around was particularly impressive. Heck yeah, Seth said, bouncing off the bed. I've missed too much. I'm not missing this. Kendra got up as well, although her feelings were more conflicted than Seth. Rather than wanting to witness Vanessa's final sentence as a novelty, or perhaps to gloat, she hoped to reach some sense of closure for the betrayal that Vanessa had enacted. It had been the Sphinx who had recommended the quiet box. The previous day, after Vanessa had been incarcerated in the dungeon, they had all sat around filling in the blanks for each other. Grandma and Grandpa knew almost none of the story. Seth held them enthralled with how he overcame the Revenant. That was pretty impressive. And Kendra and Warren told of the descent into the tower and the battle with the cat. Tanu, Coulter, and Dale told of the rescue they had mounted. how when they had approached the grove with the Sphinx, the imp who had appeared to be guarding it had turned and fled, and how Dale had been injured by the hobgoblin. The Sphinx explained that he had been on the move because of evidence that the Society of the Evening Star was closing in on his location. Once he was clear, he became worried that nobody at Fablehaven was answering his calls, and doubly concerned when he found the gates locked and nobody responding to his solicitations for entry. Sorry. He waited there until Tanu finally answered the phone after freeing Grandpa. Tanu had opened the gates for him. In the end, the conversation had turned to Vanessa. The problem was, as a narcoblix, she could forever have power over those that she had bitten whenever they sleep. She must be shut away in a prison that will inhibit her power, the Sphinx had said emphatically. We cannot expect Mr. Lich to spend the remainder of his life watching her. At the time, Mr. Lich was in the dungeon, stationed outside her cell. Can't the sand from the artifact cure those of us who were bit? Vanessa said. I've been studying the artifact, the Sphinx said. Its healing powers appear to affect only the physical body. I do not believe it can cure maladies of the mind. The dust instantly removes the marks from her bite, but it is powerless against the mental links the bite forges. Do you know of a prison that would curtail her power? Grandpa asked. The Sphinx paused and then nodded to himself. I have a simple answer. The quiet box in your very own dungeon will suit our needs perfectly. Well, what about the current occupant? Grandpa said. I know the history of the current prisoner inside your quiet box, the Sphinx said. He has great political significance, but no talents that require such a mighty cage. I know a place where he will be no more likely to harm others. Who is he? Seth asked. Oh, for the safety of all, the identity of the prisoner must remain a mystery, the Sphinx said. Let your curiosity take comfort in the reality that for most of you the name would hold little meaning. I was present when he was sealed in the box, trussed up and hooded, disguised and unknown to the others who attended the event. I worked long to ensure his capture and to keep all knowledge of him hidden. Now I will provide the anonymous captive with new confinement so the quiet box can be used to secure the type of villain for which it was designed. Morally, with her as our prisoner, we cannot execute Vanessa, but neither can we reward her treachery with leniency or provide her with the slightest opportunity to inflict further harm. Quiet box. All had agreed that it was a sound plan. Seth had asked to be present for the prisoner exchange. Kendra had seconded the request. The Sphinx said that he saw no harm in it, since this current occupant of the quiet box was unrecognizable behind his mask and bindings. Grandpa had granted permission. As Kendra followed Grandpa and Seth down the stairs, she reflected that this punishment was in many ways worse than an execution. From what she had gathered, imprisonment in the quiet box meant centuries of uninterrupted solitude. The box put the occupant in a suspended state, but did not render the prisoner entirely unconscious. She could not imagine complete sensory deprivation for a day, let alone a year. But this was potentially many lifetimes standing upright inside a snug container. She could only guess at the psychological consequences of such extended isolation. Kendra was hurt that Vanessa had betrayed her, and glad to see her come to justice, but the prolonged confinement of the quiet box struck her as a heavy price for even the most heinous crime. Even so, the Sphinx was right. Vanessa could not be permitted to exert further control over those that she had bitten. They met Grandma in the kitchen and descended together into the dungeon. Sorry, guys. Where they found Mr. Lich escorting Vanessa from her cell, with a firm grip on her upper arm. The Sphinx nodded gravely. Once again we prepare to part ways, he said. Hopefully our next meeting will be under less duress. Tanu, Coulter, Dale, and Warren all had opted not to attend, so the small party set off down the hall in silence toward the destination. Mr. Lich led the way with Vanessa so Kendra could not see her. Vanessa was dressed in one of Grandma's old housecoats, but she still held her head erect. Before long they reached the tall cabinet that reminded Kendra of magicians making lovely assistants vanish. The Sphinx turned and faced them. Let me stress one last time what exemplary courage and character all of you showed in thwarting this insidious attempt to steal a potentially ruinous artifact. Kendra and Seth, both of you displayed remarkable valor. Words cannot convey my sincere admiration and gratitude. Once we release this prisoner, Mr. Litch and I will need to make a hasty departure. Rest assured that we have a safe home in mind for both the artifact and the captive from the quiet box, and that we will telephone you, Stan, to confirm that all is safe and secure. When the prisoner emerges, make no sound until we are gone. My cautious nature would rather he not hear your voices or receive any other clues about who we are. The Sphinx turned to Vanessa. Have you any final words before you learn why we call it the quiet box? Take heed. Any utterance that passes your lips had best be words of apology. He held his voice with a menacing edge. Vanessa turned to look at each of them. I apologize for the deceit. I never meant any of you physical harm. A false friendship is a terrible thing, Kendra. Though you might not believe it, I remain your pen pal. Enough, the Sphinx said. Make no professions of continued fidelity. We pity your fate, and collectively we wish that you had not brought this evil upon yourself. You have sought forbidden knowledge and committed unforgivable betrayals. You had my trust, but now it is irretrievable. The Sphinx opened the cabinet. The inside was lined with purple felt. The box was empty. Seth craned his neck and then gave Kendra a befuddled glance. Where was the current occupant? Mr. Lish ushered Vanessa into the box. Her eyes were cold, but her jaw trembled. The Sphinx closed the door, and the cabinet rotated 180 degrees, so it turned around. Mr. Lish opened a door identical to the first, providing a new view of the same space from the opposite side. But this view was not of Kendra. Instead, a figure clad entirely in burlap stood inside the box. A coarse sack covered his head, chained snugly around his neck. Thick ropes bound his arms to his side, and shackles gripped his ankles. Mr. Litch laid a hand on his shoulder and led the mysterious captive out of the box. The Sphinx closed the door. Kendra, Seth, Grandpa, and Grandma watched as the prisoner shuffled away down the hall between the Sphinx and Mr. Litch. Grandma put an arm around Kendra, giving her a comforting squeeze. That night, Kendra couldn't sleep. Her mind was whirling with the events of the past few days. They had been through so much, it had seemed like she had returned to Fablehaven a lifetime ago. Midsummer's Eve was a few days away, Grandpa said, emphasizing to Seth that they were putting their lives into his hands by permitting him to remain on the preserve during that perilous evening. Her brother had assured everyone that he had learned his lesson and that he would stay far away from the windows unless otherwise instructed. Kendra was almost surprised to discover that, like her grandpa, she absolutely believed him. One particular thought kept recurring as Kendra lay awake in the dark. Vanessa's last words kept striking her as increasingly peculiar. I remain your pen pal. Kendra knew she might be crazy, but she felt certain that the statement was more than a platitude. It sounded like Vanessa might be hinting at a secret message. Deciding that she had to know, Vanessa kicked off the covers. Opening the nightstand drawer, she removed the Umite candle that Vanessa had given her. She padded across the attic floor and down the stairs to the hall. Kendra eased open the door to Grandma and Grandpa's room. Like everyone else in the house, they were sleeping soundly. There were the dungeon keys on a peg near the bed. Grandpa had sworn he was going to make copies and hide them in strategic locations in case of another takeover. Kendra hesitated. This was a disturbingly Seth-like thing for her to be doing. Shouldn't she just tell her grandparents her suspicions and have them accompany her? But she was worried that they would not want her reading a farewell message from Vanessa. And she was worried that they might be right, that the message would somehow be cruel. She was also worried that she was wrong and that there was no message and that she would look foolish. So, quietly removing the keys from the peg, Kendra left the room. She was getting good at sneaking around. Being able to see in the dark certainly helped. Kendra tiptoed down the stairs to the entry hall. Would there really be a message? In many ways, she would be relieved if the cell wall was blank. What could Vanessa have to say? A sincere apology? An explanation? More like something spiteful. Kendra steeled herself against the possibility. Whatever the message, it was hers to read. She did not want others going through her mail, at least not until after she'd had a look. Vanessa took matches from the kitchen cupboard and descended the stairs to the basement. Getting to Vanessa's cell would be simple. They had held her in the fourth cell on the right, not far from the dungeon entrance. When Mr. Litch watched her, could Vanessa have written much of a message? Maybe. He was only there to prevent her from going into a trance and taking over people. He might not have he might not have had his eyes glued to her every second. Kendra unlocked the iron door to the dungeon and entered. The goblins could make no complaint here against her. They had received 6 dozen eggs, 3 live geese, and a goat for aiding Kendra and Seth when they had showed up in the miniature. As long as she went straight to Vanessa's cell and then left, visiting the dungeon secretly could not possibly cause any harm. Maybe the idea wasn't quite as Seth-like as it sounded. She unlocked Vanessa's cell and entered. As had become routine for Kendra since the fairies had altered her vision, it was dim but not terribly dark. The cell was like the others she had seen. Stone walls and floor, crude bed, hole in the corner for waste. She struck a match and lit the candle, suddenly certain that there would be no message. Beneath the glow of the Umite candle, words flared into view, cramped but legible, covering multiple patches of the floor. A much longer message than Kendra had anticipated. The words were oriented, so that they must have been written while Vanessa was crouched with her back to the door, while most of the writing concentrated in areas that were hard to see from the little window. In mounting wonder and alarm, Kendra read the following message. Dear Kendra, I have vital information to share with you. Call it a final tutorial and a parting shot at my treacherous employers. You should have learned the lesson I shared when we first met. What is textbook society infiltration? Set up a threat, then come to the rescue in order to rebuild a trust. Errol did it to you and Seth. Then I did the same thing to you and your grandparents, pretending to be part of the solution rather than the cause of the problem. Legitimately helping most of the time until the moment of betrayal arrived. Others have been using that same model for a long time, with infinite subtlety and patience, namely the Sphinx. Your reflex will be to doubt me, and I cannot prove that I am right. My gifts made me privy to secrets that piqued my curiosity, and when I dug deeper, I unearthed a truth that I should have left undiscovered. He suspects that I know his secret, which is why he will confine me to the quiet box. He would prefer if he could have me executed. I work for him, but I am not supposed to know the identity of my employer. Very few know the leader of the Society of the Evening Star. For months, I believe, the Sphinx has suspected that I guessed his true identity. The kind of fraud he is perpetrating could endure only with supreme discretion and meticulous attention to detail. In his mind, I have become a danger because I know he is actually the leader of the Society of the Evening Star. The Sphinx could have claimed he had a prison that could hold me and impede my powers. He could have taken me with him, and if he had, he would have earned my undying loyalty. At present, I would still be in doubt as to his intentions, but Litch, not fully understanding the dynamics of the situations, hinted about the quiet box, and so I scrawl my revenge on the floor. Consider the coup this is for the Sphinx. As a known traitor, I am a spoiled asset for the society, and therefore of much less use to him. He gets to look like the hero and the sure friend of Fablehaven as he locks me in the most secure prison on the property, further obscuring the truth of his real nature. In case his suspicions are correct, and I know his true identity, I am permanently out of the equation. What else? He frees a prisoner who is undoubtedly a powerful ally, and he walks away with the artifact that I was sent here to retrieve for him. This could be a lie, but keep your eyes open and time will confirm my version of things. The reason the Sphinx knows so much, and he anticipates danger so well, is because he is playing both sides. He is causing the danger, and then providing relief and advice until those perfect moments of betrayal arrive. Who knows how many artifacts he has collected? He has been at it for centuries. Considering his actions at Fablehaven and in Brazil, and his apparent decision that the time for aggressiveness has arrived. Beware, the evening star is rising. Had he trusted me, his secret would still be safe. But he spurned me, and he underestimated me, and so his secret is revealed. My loyalty is no longer his. I know much more that could be useful to you and your grandparents. If not your friend, your disillusioner, Vanessa. So, that's the end of the book, guys. That's the end. Can you believe this one person who's supposed to be like the most in charge of everybody on the good side is actually the most in charge of everybody on the bad side? And he locked up Vanessa. I wonder if in book 3 they let Vanessa out. You know what? I've never read book 3. So, you guys should finish listening to all of this Fablehaven book 2 and then go get book 3 and read it with your parents this summer. How fun. I know people love the rest of the books as much as these two. So, I hope you guys enjoy it and have a wonderful summer. I miss you to pieces. And come visit me during the school year.